Hey everyone! In my previous video I showed you everything that goes into a fashion designer's degree assessment, and I sort of outlined it rather than showing everything in detail because that video would have been incredibly long. I decided to break it down into multiple parts, and today I'm going to be showing you a flip through of my second degree collection sketchbook. As you can see, my backdrop was different. I am finally out of that flat in Moscow which I've been filming every video in for the past couple of months, and I'm in my parents' house in Estonia. This time I was walking across the border for the first time, and I took one train to St. Petersburg from Moscow, another train to Ivangorod, taxi until the border, and then I was walking across the border for the first time in my life. All the previous times I've been flying and it was quite easy and the routine was basically set, and this time was quite funny. And the whole travel took, I don't know, over 12 hours I think, because I had a 5-hour layover in St. Petersburg with my friends, and then my parents picked me up in Narva, which is the border city next to Ivangorod, and then we had another 3-hour ride until Tallinn. So it was my first ever road trip. But now I'm finally home. You can hear the birds singing, the background is very beautiful, and my parents' yard is just incredible. I'll show you that next time. But since Gilda decided to join us, let's get into the video.
If you haven't watched my first sketchbook tour, I suggest you watch it before this, because it won't really make much sense for you to see what is going on in this sketchbook with me referencing a lot of different things from the previous sketchbook. So I'll link it down below as well as in the clickable I button. The sketchbook that I'm using is an A3 handmade sketchbook, which you may have seen me make in a video tutorial of mine, which I'll leave down below in the clickable I button as well. Now, because it's a second sketchbook for my degree collection and it is a continuation of what I haven't finished in the first sketchbook, it doesn't really make sense for me to start with a new mood word or something, so I just started with the exploration of new potential printing methods. There's a little lino cut piece which I tested for how deep it is, then a little piece of plastic which I used for a dry point needle, and both of those techniques I tested out for the first time when I went to our university's printmaking induction on alternative ways of printing, because prior to that I had only tested silkscreen and sublimation printing, both of which are great techniques, but I just wanted to explore something a bit more tactile. In the first semester we've been focusing on textile and a little bit more of surface manipulations, and now in the second semester with this sketchbook I wanted to explore shape. Obviously that was in our curriculum as well, so I started by sketching out like a first version of what I was imagining my collection to look like. And because I wanted to explore the idea of a person being so overwhelmed with paperwork and like sort of being in between the passport pages, I drew a very straightforward sketch on the right, which is not exactly what I wanted to go for. I wanted to be a little bit more discreet, but that would be an inspiration for my future design development. So every idea, every thought just goes on the page, even if it's stupid, even if it feels strange at the time. So I started looking around at how you play around with paper. You start crumpling it, you start, pleating it to make a little fan. So I started just testing different versions and trying to combine them together. On the left page, the fifth experiment that you see, the pleated version, is the actual beginning of those trousers which I made for look number 1, and the ones I've been talking non-stop for the past couple of months because they're the only thing I managed to sew before quarantine. So those trousers, this little experiment, actually became the starting point for the trousers of one of the looks. The basis of that little experiment is actually my distorted passport scan, which I arranged with some other different distorted scans into a plaid, and then I printed them out on a little piece of paper, and then I played around with them on a scanner once again to distort them even more, and then I printed them out and pleated and crumbled this little thing. So there's a lot of process and a lot of layers in process, which you wouldn't have noticed unless I told you. You can also see my color palette. With this page I was exploring airport pat downs, and I wanted to see the opposing sides of how intrusive the process of your body scans and your pat downs is, as opposed to just a very formal passport photo, very formal passport language and everything of that nature. So with this intrusion experiment I drew out the front and back of the body, and I outlined and sketched out little sections in the ways that the body is being pat down, and I drew the lines as well in what direction that goes for me to later on try and experiment with. And those airport body scans I used as a reference for me to later on play around with print, but then this page I was just writing out what they mean, what words strike out for me. Maybe that would be an inspiration for me to later on play with silhouette, for example, because those pat downs to me are extremely revealing and body is being shown. I definitely knew that those words meant a lot to me, and I wanted to implement them into the silhouette of my garments. So later on it played around as a very body hugging, very tight pair of leggings and a top with a print. In here I also extorted a little color palette from those images, and it didn't really mean that I wanted to entirely make my collection blue, but it could give me a little potential inspiration for the direction that the color palette could go into. After those pat down experiments, I really wanted to play around with silhouettes of that idea, so I tried to push my hand through the fabric and only make it stick in those areas where my palm was, and I wanted to make it like a different pleating slash fabric draping experiment without making it too obvious. And I tested it out, and I tried like a spray adhesive and it didn't really work, and you can see me struggling with that in a couple of vlogs back, which I'll also link below. But it didn't work out, and I tried to stick it in the sketchbook and it wasn't sticking, so it doesn't really look like I planned it to, but it was a valuable experience for me to stop playing around with it later on. But it did not stop right away, because I went to a ceramic workshop. I made a cast of my palm, and then once it dried, I soaked my fabric in gelatin solution and pressed it down with chickpeas because I didn't have any weight for it to press down, and while it was drying, I was hoping for it to keep the shape, which it did, but the gelatinized solution also made the fabric too stiff for me to see any drapery, so it was sort of a failed experiment, but at least I played around with it. I mean, the idea was cool. If you have any ideas for how to make it work and how to keep the drapes from being too tight, that could be amazing, because initially I thought of just soaking maybe my hand in that gelatin solution and placing it on, and then pouring chickpeas over it, and maybe pouring chickpeas with gelatin solution so that the solution would soak into fabric, but I mean that was too complicated, and I also had to move on from that little experiment, so I just left it there. And here's another thing that should have been left somewhere else, because I never ended up using those experiments, but I played around with my old tie prints. If you remember, my first sketchbook had a very different vibe than this one in the final collection at all, so in here I was just trying to bring back those pleated tie experiments, and one of the prototypes that I ended up submitting as the third prototype for my first assessment. I wasn't quite happy with it. I was trying to play around with it to see what sparks joy, what brings inspiration for it. And with the next page, I also tried different manipulations on the body to see what colors work. But maybe because I was not quite satisfied with the color palette, and with me bringing a new one in here again, I could not exactly decide what direction I wanted to take. So I just decided to scrap this idea, to just stop playing around with color and focus on developing shapes of different prototypes. And that's pretty much what's been happening here. I've been making range plans, and this was one of the first ones I did in the new sketchbook. When working on your collection, you get so focused and your mind is always preoccupied with thinking of new ways of adding new ideas. You get into a sort of mode of passive design development. So even when you're working on something else, you notice that you drift away to thinking about the collection. So in my case, passing through the mirror, I always notice that my clothing is draping somehow, and I start pulling and playing around with it, even if that is not related to the collection at all. So in here, you notice I added some photos where I was just playing around with another top I was wearing, and it sparked some random inspiration because of the lines that were draping up. I started playing around with the pleated patchwork sample, which you see on the right, and then it sparked inspiration for potential accessories. It's already a third color palette, and we're just a couple of pages into the new sketchbook. On the bottom left on that little plastic folder, you can see my tutorial records that someone took for me during a lineup, and then on the right you see the photos of a mannequin, and this is a reflection of that pat down body map experiment that I drew on the second or third page in the sketchbook. Because of the lines that I drew, I followed them the way that I was pleating the fabric. So if the pleats went down, that means that the line of that body pat down was going downwards, and I tried to follow it, and I loved the experiment, but it looked a little bit too warrior-like, and I thought that this was not fitting the collection, so it had to go. But I didn't really want to let go of it so easily, so I tested out multiple different options, multiple ways of pleating it, and playing around with different sizes of pleats. So I even created a new pleating board for that specific reason, a smaller one, and I didn't exactly know where I wanted to take it, but I knew that this was not going to work with pleats, so I just played around with a little bit of jersey experiments, and I tried to fuse it, and so from there on out I thought I could recreate the same top but in jersey. I followed the same map but tried to work with jersey and pulling the fabric, but because the jersey would not stay the same way on a mannequin pin to it as to when I started taking it off, I had to fuse some areas, and the fused jersey against draping jersey did not look good. Like on a mannequin it was fine, but as soon as you took it off and put it on the body, it looked very weird. It sort of looked like a hunchback from Notre Dame, because the back was not really stretching out because of the lack of sleeves. It was just basically ballooning, and it didn't look right. But because I love that experiment and I love the amount of work that went into even the design process and the logic behind the top, I really wanted to play around with it a bit more, so I started erasing some elements, deleting areas, and tried to make it like a bralette, which I thought could look pretty interesting over a jacket, creating some, I don't know, pulling or draping, but that didn't look good at all, so I had to scrap the idea once again. With this page I was exploring and referencing a design that I made for the first assessment, and with this one I was so in love with how it turned out because it was such an accidental thing. I don't know if you remember, but because because I had a little meltdown and a problem with my computer the day before assessment of semester A, I lost all of my 50 designs that I made at that point. So at I think 12 o'clock at night I had to remake all of them, and that was such a quick, fast process of photoshopping and just mapping things out that this design was born just out of scrap pieces of those photoshopped collages that I was making. And I ended up being in love with it so much that I started recreating it and started, I don't know, holding on to it as look number 6 for my potential design. And because I got a lot of donated coloured leather from a designer called Anka, I'll leave her down below as well, I placed them in here alongside of those scanned passport experiments, which I used as a background for that design development. Composition wise, I like the page, and it also got another tutorial record, and I think it makes sense. It has a lot of logic. It is very straightforward as to how I wanted to make it, but it was still a mystery to me, so I just left it at that point in here. And when I moved on, I decided to develop it a bit further. As you can see on the bottom, there is another lineup which is quite different, even though you can't exactly see all the 6 designs in here. And I was exploring a way of making that look number 6 in an actual garment, and at that point I was still thinking of making like a flat sheet with a bunch of recycled pieces of fabric which were holding on by a wire to the body, like a backpack essentially, and it wasn't exactly working out. So some of the scraps of those pieces you can see on the top. On the left you see a passport scan of my distorted passport which got washed in a washing machine the day before I had to fly with my dad, so it was quite fun. I don't know what I wanted to do with this page. I was trying to just dump my thoughts on a page and see what happens, which is also a very necessary thing to do sometimes. Here you can see a couple of photos of those lineups that we tried on. At that point we were asking a couple of models to come in, but we didn't really have enough of them, so we had to pose for each other. And I think Tanya is trying to wear that thingy I tried to create for look number 6, and it is not exactly working out that well. And then with this page we are coming back to those fused jersey experiments. I was trying multiple different colors, multiple different weights of fabric, and I wanted to see how they perform, because the fusing I used was quite porous and quite, I don't know, wide woven, and I liked that you could see the creases through the fusing, and it was not as obvious as you just seeing the creases. So I was playing around with different colors to see if you would see more of that creasing against the black fabric or something else. And I discovered that white creased jersey against that very porous, very wide fusing looks best against black. So if I were to make a jacket with the reverse side of the fusing as the main side, I would have to line it with a dark fabric for it to be visible. This is another like random page. In here I got a long train dress, I guess, pleated dress that my sister gave to me, which got donated to her somehow, and I wasn't exactly using it as a garment itself, so I tried to cut it into pieces because I wanted to reuse the sleeves. They were very tiny pleating and I loved it, and it was jersey, so I started draping it on my leg and seeing how it works, and it got me a couple of ideas for potential maybe trouser development or accessories like shoes which could be draped with fabric. And also coming back to that experiment in the first or like second page where I pleated the distorted scanner experiments, I just played around with different versions of pleating and like a very tiny version of pleating. And because I knew I was going to use leather as well, and I had a bit of fake leather left over, I tried to pleat it as well to see maybe if that would work interestingly. And on the middle of that page on the right, you can see like creased leather experiments. I mean something that looks like leather. It's not leather, I think it's plaster and fabric, but it looks pretty interesting, so I thought maybe I could stiffen the fabric to keep the shape in some areas if I were to come back to the fused jersey experiment and take a different approach to it. Another page, another color palette, and also a couple of sketches for potential placement of my lino cut prints. At this point I tested them out on fabric, and I tested them on multiple different kinds of fabric. So I creased, I think it was creased calico, fused again, then white cotton and different other options, and then I sewn a couple of pieces together, and then I thought that could be a pretty interesting leather extension. And again on the left you can see me trying on another leather top, which was an extension of that idea of a jersey top, which was an extension of a pleated top, which was an experiment of those pat down thingies. So I could not leave that pat down experiment for the life of me, and I tried 3 or 4 different top options at that point, but this was my final attempt. Like, I was done with it. I'm sorry, it was not working out. I couldn't do anything with it, and I think I might come back to that idea just because I love the amount of process that went into it. I think it's a personal vendetta against me, so I'm gonna have to make something with it. As I said, I tried different lino cut prints, and I distorted those lino cut prints on the scanner once I've I've done with them. And on the top left you can see the actual lino piece. Because I used blue ink, it turned quite dark blue, and I think I'm going to be reusing this little lino cut piece for an accessory. And I loved how it all distorted on a scanner. I just love scanner. I think it's my favorite tool for fashion print development at this point. This page is a development of that look number 6. As you can see, I tried to play around with the same shape but to move it on another design. In here it's number 2 on my lineup, and I tried to make an extension of a sleeve to play around with the same silhouette but in a different form. And on the bottom right of this page you can see a clear reference of Chopovalov skirt. And again, this is another range plan, a very questionable look number 4, which I think look number 4 has been a question mark for the longest time for me, and I only developed it maybe like a month before assessment, so at this point it's non-existent. At some point during our degree collection development, our textile printer, sublimation printer, was not working for a long time, for like 3 weeks straight, so we had to come up with alternative ways of working. And I think if the printer was working, I wouldn't have developed this cool new idea of a print. I was working with leather, and I was trying a debossing method, so I was pressing little paper clips, metal paper clips, against the leather under a heat press, and it left a little debossing effect, which I loved absolutely. But during that process, I discovered that my leather is bleeding color, and I decided to play around with it and use it to my advantage. So I left a soaked cotton fabric, then spread out my paper clips sporadically, and it left a very beautiful uneven trace, and I think that's the most genius thing I've ever done. I mean, it's so simple, it's straightforward, but I loved it so much, so I'm going to be using that in my collection as well. This is a development of that skirt from look number 6. I'm not sure if you've been focusing on that skirt at all, but that's an extension skirt, which looks like a cut passport once you get a new one and your old one is expired. I didn't really take much time on developing it because it was quite straightforward, like a pencil skirt with an extension, and I made a little prototype out of leftover faux leather, which I found in my locker from a previous graduate. On the right you see some finishing samples, leather finishing samples that I asked my helper from level 4 to make, though thank you Lisa again. Actually you can see the process of level 4 helpers helping us in one of my vlogs, which I'll leave down below in the I button again. This is a page for me writing out every little detail about the trouser construction. And this page I was trying to work around that idea of a sleeve extension for a shirt, and I was looking for alternative ways of incorporating the idea of paperwork into those, so I was playing around with adding an extension out of the sleeve instead of making the puffery sleeve. Another lineup and another tutorial record. I hated look number 5 at that point, so I just covered it up because it was so disgusting. And here I was sort of finalizing fabrics for some of the looks. So look number 2 was genuine leather that I bought from Avito as a coat, and some faux leather that I had left over for multiple years before. This is one of my favorite pages. I love how you can see the front and then the reversed side of the jacket that I was pulling apart for this skirt, and all of the leftover little pieces. My experiment, my debossing experiment, my fabric leather transfer experiment, the scratching so that I could make the leather even more old and reveal the underlying, the suede color, and the pleating. So there's multiple different experiments. You can see the stitching as well. I love the page. I think it's kind of chaotic and it expresses the energy that I wanted to. This was my final lineup before the corona hit us, and you can see it's way more muted than before, especially way more muted than the first lineups I did in the sketchbook. And on the right you can see a bit of that skirt development. On the left you see the trouser development. So at that point I only had a cut and patchworked leather skirts pieces and nearly finished trousers. And this is the most random and like entry-level experiment that I did on this sketchbook, because corona hit, I was home, I was not exactly sure what I wanted to do, so I just played around with bleach and transferring the bleach pressed, I think, fabric that I tried to crumple up like paper. Also, you can see a tutorial record from a 4th lineup that we had, and I was so glad that our tutor moved our lineup to Monday instead of Wednesdays, because that was the last lineup that we would have had for the rest of the collection. It was very timely. Afterwards, I resorted to my favorite method of developing a collection, is actually just playing around with my actual clothing. And because at that point I was discussing with my tutor Claire to find a way to find a top for look number 1 to make it more simple, and because I didn't really want to make it like a very straightforward top at the time, I tried to at least play around with the body and play around with the bust area, because that would essentially be the only visible area at that point, because the trousers are quite high-waisted. And I played around with it. I did multiple different experiments, as you can see, and I landed on 3 different options, all of which I tried to position within the collection within the look number 1, and I collared them together, and I don't think any of them worked, even though I really wanted them to. On their own, the tops are quite nice, but with those trousers, I didn't want the tops to be dominant, because the trousers themselves are also pleated, high-waisted, asymmetrical with asymmetrical pattern and crumble bottom. They're like very loud, and I wanted the attention to be on them, so I landed on the top being just a very straightforward printed long sleeve, and that those tops would just have to go. I think the biggest thing I learned during this degree collection development was the fact that you have to just let go of things, even if you don't want them to. But because of that top development process that I went through, from pleated to jersey to leather, I just had to go through that process to learn to just edit. Editing is the most important part of a fashion design process, in my opinion. So that printed top I was talking about, it came from those body scan experiments, and I had to ask my model to be completely nude front and back and side. I took photos of her and then I Photoshop those. I modified her body as well so that she wouldn't feel uncomfortable. I just erased some of her birthmarks and everything so that she would not be exactly definable, and I played around with her curves as well. So I just edited different color options and layered them on top of each other to find the print I would be satisfied with. And while I was playing with it, I was also wearing like a giant t-shirt dress, and when I was passing the mirror once again, I played around with it and I started tucking it into my high-waisted underwear, and I found that this tucking method looks very interesting and beautiful, and that was the drapery my collection lacked, that softness and that gentle touch. So I made a quick illustrated drawing of it, which ended up being the only and the final version of that Illustrator design look number 5 I made. So I was very happy with it, and this print landed on that top dress, t-shirt, whatever the fuck it is, and I loved it. So in here you can also see multiple different colorways that I tried with that body print top, and multiple different cutaways as well. I tried to make it a short sleeve, a long sleeve, high neck, short neck, but then ended up with a high neck, long sleeve. And it might sound like paradoxical, but with the amount of body that is covered, it does not attract much attention, and even though it's a fully printed long sleeve top, it just simplifies the body. Another range plan, and here I also had multiple different technical drawings that I made for look number 5, 2 and 3, and also a couple of notes for myself to remember what I wanted to change, because we had at that point another tutorial with Claire. As I mentioned, I left my look number 6 for the longest time and I didn't really want to make changes to it, so Claire suggested I break it down into layers and actually explain what the look consists of, and I did that, just that. In Illustrator I drew everything out, and I decided that the drapery on the back would not be an extension from the whatever the fuck the top was, but would be a backpack. So I just sketched out an idea for that backpack on the right, and essentially I had that idea in mind from the first sketchbook. If you remember, on the beginning pages there is a person sketched out pretty much the same way. I just wanted to transfer it here to keep that idea in mind, not to forget it again. And I started researching backpacks, and I wanted to see travel backpacks which people fly as a carry-on thing, and I love their construction because they're so intricate. There are so many seams where I could put those extensions into, so I started doing just that, and I broke the backpack down into sections and I tried to make it out of paper, my half-scale mannequin. At that point I did another range plan, and I also broke down into layers my look number 5, because I thought initially that that would be 4 individual layers all draped together and tucked into an underwear base or something, and I just showed Claire multiple different options. I did the front and the back, and as you can see, look number 4 is a giant question mark. Now literally it's just a question mark on a naked body, so at that point I had absolutely no idea how that would look like. In here I remember, you can read all the notes on the right if you wanted to, but look number 2 was the biggest problem at that point, because I love the silhouette and the back and everything, but because look number 1, 2 and 3 were very similar in waistline, I had to either raise the waistline of look number 2 and lower the waistline, or just erase it or do something completely different, because the backs of the top look exactly the same in my opinion. So it was also a problematic little detail. And I think this is a reoccurring thing in my collection, but I'm focusing more on the trousers and the bottom part of the body, and the top part is sort of like a given for me to later on develop. And in here I came to also develop a top version for trousers, and the same thing had to occur. So the top had to be very simple, not to take any attention from the trousers because they're so dominant. And I absolutely hated the thing that I did in here, because I played around with like crumbled bustier, and it was not it, absolutely not it. And on the right you can see I was playing around with different finishings, because I wanted to add another layer of process to those trousers, as if they were not difficult enough. So I explored different options from my research, which could be a potential either laser cut or pleating or print experiment, I don't know. These are just transferred experiments from my first sketchbook to this one, because I wanted to play around with them again, and I forgot my first sketchbook in university, and now that it was under coronavirus mode I could not access it, so I just had to move it in here. And from those undressing experiments came a coat experiment. I just took a very long donated coat which I got from my boyfriend's mother, and I started playing around with them on my body, taking video and then screenshotting a bunch of those, and I just glued them all inside this page of a sketchbook because I love to see like a full bleed version of whatever I'm working on. And I took my favorite ones from there, I cut them in Photoshop to just save that little coat drapery, and then I sketched them out on the page, and then I sketched them over, like traced them, and then I drew them in Illustrator, just the 3 of my favorite ones. I added print over them, and then I played around with them on the little body template that I had. At that point, Claire and I discussed the fact that look number 6 has been too simple and too straightforward as it's been for a while, and I didn't really want to make any changes to it, but I think it was time because it was very close to the deadline, I think maybe 1.5 months before it. So I started making changes, and after those experiments it was quite evident that this look number 6 could not be left similar to what it's been before. It had to be a completely new look. So I made another lineup with those sort of similar details from the old look number 6, and I just scrapped it at that point because I realized that it was not working at all. This is the evidence of our technical tutorial with a technician. She was trying to help us understand how to work with creating specification sheets, and I've gone over them in my previous video so you can check them out, but in here she was just trying to help me understand how we would actually sew the thing, because in technical specification sheets you have to explain every little detail, every seam, every fastening method, so you have to be quite thorough, and without actually having constructed any of the things besides trousers, it was quite difficult to imagine how you would actually make them, because usually during the construction process you go through multiple different changes and iterations, and your garment doesn't exactly look or is constructed the same way as you expected it to be, so it was quite a challenge. So looking at that page, you would not say that this is look number 6 because it has absolutely no resemblance to what I was working on before, but that's because those previous pages ended up being for look number 5, and this is look number 6 because I wanted it to be theatrical. If you remember, I played around with a blank before in my first assessment and in my studio vlogs that I'll be linking down below, but in here I actually came back to that experiment because I was not about to let go of that ginormous 2-meter long fused blank that I had, and I was holding on to it for some reason too much. I was so attached to it, and Claire was like, oh, I don't know how it could work, and I just kept having it, and she said like, just leave it, maybe you'll come back to it, and I did. Like finally look number 6 is something that just existed in the beginning stages, and it's quite interesting to me. So I made it into like a giant dress, and the construction method of it is just so crazy. Again, you can check it out in the technical specification sheets because there's so many details regarding the construction, even though this just looks like a giant blank creased in the waistline. It's not, trust me. On the right of that page you can see those leggings that I was talking about when I was saying about the body hugging and playing around with silhouette, which came from the inspiration from the print, and I initially wanted to have them a bit more detailed, I guess, so they would have a print on the side, and also I have like a creased fabricy texture, paper looking texture on the front, but it was not necessary for that look because the look itself is quite theatrical and the focus is on silhouette. The base structure could be quite simple, so I ended up just taking a regular legging and top option. But the leggings are not exactly simple, so I got inspiration from look number 5 with those tucked in underwear details, so the leggings themselves also have that reoccurring tucked in underwear detail. And on the right you can see I was playing around with a different idea, so I had like a giant oversized paper clip which I bent out of a hanger, and I attached it to my leggings and tried to pull it in different directions, and I thought that could be interesting for me to make 2 layers of clothing interact. So I thought I could construct my leggings with the paperclip thingy, which could connect to that dress oversized blank idea. I ended up just not doing that because that would be an extra little detail that could overcomplicate the whole process, and with designs, with collections, you had to think in a collection mode, so I had to repeat a little element for me to make a construction process a bit easier. And here you see the last page of my sketchbook. Actually, it does not look like a final page because I'm still planning on adding work process to it when I start constructing the collection once we come back from quarantine. I ended up again playing around with the body, and I added my giant layered shoulder pads, which again my helper Lisa helped me make, and I played around with it. I loved how it's draping, but this was again the case of me trying to make something more difficult that it doesn't have to be. So I again just ended up for a simple printed top instead of that printed, draped and shoulder padded top, but I love the process regardless. On the bottom right you see my final lineup. Actually no, it's not final, Jesus, I made another 2 options, but okay, this is as close to final lineup as it will get in the sketchbook. So this is not a guarantee, but I might be filming another collection development sketchbook just because once we come back from quarantine and start sewing, I will be taking a bunch of photos. I don't think it's going to be happening alongside the collection development because I'm going to be filming the process of sewing my garments and not focusing so much on the sketchbook since it's not needed. I'm still going to be using it just because I'm so comfortable with using it alongside of the process, but I don't think it's going to be so aesthetically pleasing before I actually finish with the garments and have some time to focus on it. So it might be coming, it might not come, but I hope this was productive and helpful for you. Maybe that's going to give you a bit of an outline what a collection development process is, and maybe give you some inspiration regarding maybe the composition or anything. If you're actually focusing on composition in the sketchbook, you could watch a video of my guide how to work in a sketchbook, because I used a couple of references from my older sketchbooks throughout the 4 years of university and used my final sketchbooks as well, so you will see how you could actually improve your sketchbook work if you're looking for something like that.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for next week because I'm going to be showing you a flip through of my portfolio.